Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is Dr. Soul Brother at you once again with another program with some remedies that'll help to cure your ills. I promise not to be long, but I must be strong. This broadcast, or this show, podcast rather, I want to pay tribute to somebody who we all know and knew as one of our greatest entertainers that we've ever produced. His name is Michael Jackson. And we have asked the question: did Michael Jackson have soul? Well, we're about to find out. I need to point out that Michael Joseph Jackson was born August 29th, 1958, and unfortunately left us June 25th, 2009. I'm sure we all remember where we were when we got the surprising news that he had passed on. I certainly know where I was. But moving right along, I want to point out how Michael Jackson was a product of working class background. His daddy was his father Joseph Walter Jackson, was a working class brother who um, worked in the steel mill, and his mother worked part time, I believe, in Sears or one of those stores there in the Gary community. That's where the family was from. Father being from Arkansas, I think Fountain Hill, Arkansas, and the mother, this is Catherine Jackson, being from Barber County, Alabama, originally. But they both ended up in East Chicago, Indiana, and then hooked up, got married, and moved to Gary. So that's the background of Michael Jackson in terms of his working class background. But in order to understand it, you got to understand this also. When you hear his voice, and I'm talking about like from childhood to going into adulthood, you hear the voice of our people, black folk. You hear just like any other black artist who came about, whether you're talking about Marvin Gaye, Gladys Knight, Jackie Wilson, Wilson Pickett, Aretha Franklin, just to name a few. The list is too long to mention. We've produced some great ones right here on American soil. You can hear the experience of black folk from slavery and post slavery, I'll add. To borrow from the great Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, the souls of black folk. Um, it seems that there were some people on his maternal side who had pipes. Um, and I'll deal with that in a minute. But when the Jackson Five performed in Jacksonville, Florida, in December, I want to say December 30th, 1970, there was a white reporter who said, quote, "Yes, it's the same nerve that the Beatles touched, only this time it's done by an 11-year-old soul brother." That end of quote. That reporter's name was Scott Osborne. Now, let me say this: two quick things. Number one, um, at that time in 1970, Mike was actually 12, not 11, but that's just a side note. But more importantly, um, when Scott Osborne referred to him as a soul brother, he was not being patronizing. That was real talk. And as I go into this podcast, I'll explain the whole thing about soul. And I think we need to really look at that. Uh, and there's a reason why black folk exhibit soul. And whether you're talking about soul music, the way we talk, walk, etc. They call it swagger these days, but I think it's more accurate to use the term soul. But moving along, um, Michael captured the imagination. His brothers as well, to be sure, they worked well together as a unit. But I want to focus solely on Michael for very specific reasons. Um, Michael admired people like James Brown, Jackie Wilson, Sammy Davis Jr. Um, I think it's also important to note that Michael, I read somewhere in an interview Michael cited one of the people he used to listen to at home on vinyl was Mahalia Jackson. Nope, no relation, but coincidence they share the same last name. They're both Jacksons, but again, no relation. So clearly that was the influence of his mother, because his mother would listen to black gospel music. But as far as the secular, Michael admired James Brown, Jackie Wilson, Sammy Davis Jr., folks like that. Not to mention Joe Tex and others. Um, and I want to deal with this part here in reference to his mother, Mrs. Catherine Jackson. Mrs. Catherine Jackson was quoted once in reference to her great grandfather, Mr. Kendall Brown, who sang every Sunday in Russell County, Alabama. There was a church, a Baptist church, that he was known for singing in. And he had once been a slave for an Alabama family. So that's Mrs. Jackson's great grandfather who was enslaved on the plantation there in Alabama. And this is what Mrs. Jackson had to say. Quote, people told me that when the church windows were open, you could hear my great grandfather's voice ringing out all over the valley. It would just ring out over everybody else's. And when I heard this, I said to myself, well, maybe it isn't in the blood. End of quote. Well, that's very significant. Um, I want to go to something real quick. There's a book called Roots of Soul. I think it may be out of print, but you have to forgive me. I'm a fact finder, so I'll find stuff. Roots of Soul: The Psychology of Black Expressiveness. Alfred B. Pastor, Dr. Alfred B. Pastor, and Dr. Ivory L. Toldson. ED. An unprecedented and intensive examination of Black folk expressions in the enrichment of life. And I just want to cite something real quick here. Um, like I said, I'm not going to be here long, but I think this is very, very important because it's dear to me. On page 61 in this book, man responds to the same primal impulse that pumps in the heart of the world. The man of African ancestry is the best expositor of the force experienced and expressed as rhythm. It is the exposition of rhythm that accounts for the black man's powerful capacity to vitalize human existence, adapt to the unadaptable, and survive the clutches of death, oppression. The common black man puts rhythm into whatever he does. It is so prevalent in the black community. It seems as if only a few actions can be carried out without the help of a certain rhythm. Shining shoes, performing assembly line routines, washing cars, etc. Um, then the great J.A. Rogers is quoted as saying this. Some years ago, while wandering in Cincinnati, I happened upon a Negro revival meeting at its height. The majority present were women, a godly few of whom were white. Under the influence of the spirits, the sisters would come forward and strut much of jazz enters where it would be least expected. The Negro women had perfect rhythm, while the white ones moved lamely and woodenly, in other words, stiff. The same lack of spontaneity is evident to a degree in the cultivated and inhibited Negro. And it goes on, but I just thought it was important to cite that here. Now, let me continue on with this regarding our brother Michael Jackson. Um, I want to cite there's a documentary called it's a Spike Lee documentary titled Journey from Motown to Off the Wall, and how a white fellow by the name of Bobby Colomby, if I'm pronouncing his last name right, he's a producer slash musician, pointed out how Michael, while recording the song Blame It on the Boogie, which is on the Destiny album in 1978, in the middle of the recording, yanks the headphones off, then and bolts out of the studio, the room where they were recording, and Bob Colomby thought something was wrong, so he goes after Michael. He's in the hallway, spinning and dancing. I want to know, Mike, what's going on? And Michael said, "I got to get this out." Simply put, Michael is moved by the Spirit. So that ties in to what J. Rogers and what those two authors were talking about in reference to us. Black people are people of rhythm and spirit and soul. Okay, and that is what makes our situation, our experience, very unique from others. Um, when music comes on, it hits us. Matter of fact, Mrs. Catherine Jackson cited that when Michael, I think he either was a preschooler or was an infant, one or the other. It was um, a rickety what do you call it? Washing machine, and there's a rhythm to it. And she noticed Michael rocking back and forth to the rhythm. That's so that was in him out the gate. Okay, so that's what we have there. And I also want to point out that Mrs. Jackson had her children attending a Baptist church before the conversion to Jehovah Witness. Why is that significant? It's significant because anybody who knows anything about Jehovah Witness and how they worship and their music, etc., um, a person with that type of background, you're not going to get what you got from the Jacksons. I'm not attacking any Jehovah Witness. I'm just making a point that if you look at the majority, the vast majority of our black artists here in the U.S., the music, I'm sorry, the denominations, and most of our black artists come out of, in terms of, first of all, they all come out of the black church back in the day. That's number one. But specifically, the Baptist tradition and the holiness tradition. You have a few here and there. That one might have been Catholic. This one might have been. I mean, look at Lionel Richie was raised Episcopalian in Tuskegee, Alabama, but he represents the exception. I'm talking about generally speaking, it's Baptist and holiness, and not only that, most of those who come from those kind of backgrounds come from again working class backgrounds. Okay, maybe I ought to do a show on that somewhere in the not too distant future. But I'm saying that to say that when you listen to Michael Jackson's style of singing, and even the way the brothers performed, uh, what that reflected, even in spite of their Jehovah Witness upbringing, it reflected two things: their exposure in the Black Baptist Church that they were when they were small children, coupled with the secular music that they were exposed to, including the blues records that their father, Mr. Joe Jackson, would play. I mean, Howlin' Wolf, Muddy Waters, John Lee Hooker, etc. You got to remember, Mr. Joe Jackson was a Southerner. He was from Arkansas. Well, he, as well as other fellow Southerners, that's what they did. They listened to blues music. That was the music of their time. That was the music of the region of the country that they came from. Well, anyway, um, you also have to look at how Michael Jackson would sing sometimes in falsetto, and you that was clear when you hear "Don't Stop Till You Get Enough," the first song on the Off the Wall album. Okay, um, when you hear Michael Jackson singing "Who's Loving You," and even though that was originally a Smokey Robinson song, Michael owned that as an 11-year-old boy. He owned that to the point where you had a younger generation, and I think Smokey Robinson spoke to this at Michael's memorial service, and that is, he had young people several times when they hear him performing that song, they assume, like a lot of people, myself included, at some point, that um, the Jackson Five did it first, only to find out that no, Smokey Robinson did it first. So when you hear Michael Jackson performing "Who's Loving You," just know and understand that's his rendition of Smokey Robinson's um, "Who's Loving You." The only thing is, as I said, Michael owns that. That's like his signature song. Well, um, I want to wrap this up and point this out: that when it comes to soul, Michael had it. And it was reflected. If you ever listen to Michael rapping with his brothers, you can listen to it on YouTube, rapping with his brothers in 1970. And he talked about how he loved soul food. Okay. And not only that, you can listen to how he and the brothers were rapping with each other, talking with each other, as we say, chopping it up. And I mean, they just sounded like some urban brothers from the neighborhood. I mean, growing up, I remember folks who would talk like that. You know, some of the hip language that they would use, some of the hip language we would use, some of the, um, or not just terminology, but even um, the way our, urban accents and all of that. I mean, it's clear that when you hear the Jackson Five talk, and this is again a recording in 1970, they're just chopping it up. I mean, they sound like brothers from the neighborhood. Well, clearly that was soul coming from all five of the brothers. And when you watch Michael Jackson perform with his brothers at the Miss Black America pageant in 1969, it was clear that he was truly a soul brother. You also have to factor in the era that he grew up in. This is at a time when not only was this in the 60s with the civil rights movement slash the Black Power movement and all that, there was an awakening that was taking place. And black folk were embracing our uh, our naturalness, our soulness. And what did you hear around that time? A song I think by Dyke and the Blazers. We got more soul. When we walk, we got more soul. When we talk, we got more soul, etc. Um, and Michael Jackson exhibited that. When you see Michael Jackson perform Hollywood Palace, that you can see on YouTube, Ed Sullivan Show. When you saw them perform at there was a Save the Children benefit concert in Chicago, I believe, 1972. The crowd went crazy. Same thing happened when they performed at the Forum in Inglewood, California, 1970. That was huge, huge. And it was huge in more ways than one. First of all, you got to remember, this is at a time when Michael Jackson and his brothers came on the scene. They were bigger than Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers, who came out in the 1950s. Okay, so this was a big thing, and um, for them as youngsters to come on the scene like that, and Michael being the front man, the leader. It's funny in that unit of the brothers, he was the youngest in that five guy unit, and yet he was the lead. They took cues from him. He was the small fry, but um, it was the soul of Michael Jackson that people were drawn to. It was the soul of that the brothers, the Jackson Five, that people were drawn to. And when you look at it, uh, Michael exhibited soul when he sang, danced, the way he wore his afro, um, everything about it. And this is at a time again when black folk were exhibiting uh, soul, and this is when the term soul was in vogue. And this is also around the time of what? Soul Train. This is around the time of what? Afro Sheen. This is also the time when people were like, if you hear James Brown's song with the JBs Pass the Peas. What does the beginning say? Hey Bobby, meaning Bobby Bird. Why do you like soul food? Because it makes me happy. Okay, so we were basking in our soul food. Remember you heard terms like Soulville and all of that. Well, I think it's important for people to know and understand that when you mention people like Marvin Gaye, Al Green, Donny Hathaway, Stevie Wonder, uh, Smokey Robinson, and a host of others, you cannot leave out Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson had soul when he was from a young boy. I mean, it was he you could hear the maturity as he got older, but when he was a young boy, oh no, in fact, Smokey Robinson paid him a great compliment when he referred to him as a 50-year-old midget. And a lot of people saw him like as a young boy I mean a older person in a young body. That was Mike. That was Michael Jackson. So just know and understand when you hear Michael Jackson as a young boy going into young adulthood, like when um, he and his brothers left Motown and went to Epic, you can still hear that soul in it. You can hear that when he did Off the Wall album. Okay, now things kind of changed a little bit, well, actually not a little bit, a lot, when he went to Thriller or did Thriller back in 1982. And that album, though I like it, it was good and everything, that's more pop friendly compared to Off the Wall. And I've been saying that for a minute. So um, the thing is that when black folk are in our natural soulful ness and our vibe, that is what people are drawn to. I mean, I think when Malcolm X describes in his hipster days how you had white folks who were slumming, if you will, coming to the black neighborhood to get some of that soul. And that was not uncommon back in the day. They did the same thing Central Avenue, the same thing in Harlem. They did the same thing in Boston. They did the same thing in Detroit, etc. So that's what people were drawn to, and that is what people were drawn to as it related to Michael Jackson. They were drawn to the soulfulness of somebody like him. That's what he exhibited. So yes, I want to see more of a recognition of Michael Jackson being recognized as a soul brother. So when that white reporter, Scott Osborne, said, and I'll repeat again, yes, it's the same nerve that the Beatles touched, only this time is by an 11-year-old soul brother. No, that right there, that's complimentary, and he was right on point. So even for him, this white man, to recognize that, that says a lot. So I'm gonna wrap things up. Soul Brother's gonna sign off now and just reflect on the legacy, the music, the talent of a Michael Jackson. And Michael Jackson's talent reflects what? He reflects um, the the black experience that is very unique within the United States, and is not only is it unique in the United States as it relates to other people, other ethnic groups in this country, but it's very unique as it relates to even black folks throughout the diaspora. I mean, undoubtedly, uh, Michael lit the stage with his presence when he was in places like the Caribbean, in Africa, in Brazil, et cetera, et cetera. So Michael Jackson was one of a kind. He was one of our greatest that we produced, and um, and then you also hear and see the soulfulness of Michael Jackson when you watch the movie The Wiz. At some point, I want to do a program on the Wiz and kind of give you my take on it, and we might even um, try to do a live program because I would love to hear from what other people have to say about the Wiz, and even open it up for what you had to say regarding Michael Jackson and a host of other great talent. I mean, we have really produced a lot of great talent in this country. We really have, and the fact that you have other people trying to imitate us is very telling. And when they try to imitate us, they don't try to imitate the crossover black folk. They try to emulate and imitate the raw soul. So on that note, let's keep our brother Michael Jackson in mind and put him in that category of soul. I mean, I know he's referred to as the king of pop and all that's well and good, but in his prime, in his younger years, he was clearly a soul brother. So on that note, Dr. Soul Brother is going to sign off and ask you to hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Please comment, like, dislike, any suggestions. Um, in terms of what I can add to the show or anything, I'm definitely open to that. So this is Dr. Soul Brother signing off. And until the next time, God bless.